There is a part of Africa where the Atlantic Ocean stretches directly beside one of the driest landscapes on the planet. And that creates a strange question. If the ocean is right there, why did large cities never spread across much of this coastline? Further north, Angola has major coastal cities. Far to the south, South Africa has some of the continent's most developed coastal areas. But between these populated regions is a very different landscape. Long stretches of desert reach almost directly to the Atlantic. There are roads, there are ports, there are mining operations, and there are settlements. But compared with the scale of the coastline around them, human settlement becomes remarkably sparse. And the strange part is that the ocean itself may be part of the explanation. Cold water moves northward along this coast. It helps create persistent fog. And just inland, the Namib Desert begins. So how can an ocean sit beside a desert this extreme? And if the water is only a few kilometers away, why may it still be so difficult to build a densely populated coast here? The answer begins beneath the surface of the Atlantic, and it may have less to do with the desert itself than with what the ocean is doing to the air above it. The water beside this coast isn't behaving like the warm, tropical ocean you might expect. Much of the southwestern African coastline is influenced by the Benguela current system, where cold water is brought toward the surface along the coast, and that changes the atmosphere above it. The colder ocean cools the air immediately above the water. That air can hold moisture, but the temperature structure above the coast becomes unusually stable. Instead of allowing moist air to rise freely, a layer of warmer air sits above the cooler marine air. This is part of what is known as a temperature inversion. And that matters because rising air is one of the basic ingredients behind cloud development and rainfall. Here, the atmosphere often remains stable close to the surface. So the ocean can provide moisture without turning that moisture into the kind of regular rainfall needed to support a densely settled landscape. Instead, the coast becomes famous for something much stranger: fog. The Namib receives very little rain in many coastal areas, yet fog can occur regularly and provide an important source of moisture. UNESCO describes the Namib Sand Sea as a coastal fog desert, where fog is the primary water source within the World Heritage Site. So the coast isn't simply dry. It has a different relationship with water. The Atlantic is right beside it, but much of the available atmospheric moisture arrives as a low blanket of fog rather than dependable rainfall. And that difference helps explain how a desert can exist almost directly against the sea.
But the cold current is only part of the story. There is another reason this desert doesn't simply disappear as you move away from the coastline. Look at the geography around it. The Namib isn't just a narrow strip of sand sitting beside the Atlantic. In places, the desert stretches inland across enormous areas, with gravel plains, rocky terrain, and huge dune fields forming different parts of the landscape. And the farther you move away from the coast, the atmosphere changes quickly. The cool, humid coastal layer becomes less dominant. Temperatures rise. Humidity falls. But rainfall still remains extremely limited across much of the Namib. So the desert isn't being created by one single mechanism. It is the result of several geographic conditions working together. The cold Atlantic waters help suppress rainfall near the coast. The broader circulation of the atmosphere limits the arrival of reliable moisture, and the landscape itself provides very little water for permanent settlement. There are rivers here, but many of the most important ones behave very differently from rivers in wetter parts of Africa. Some channels can remain dry for long periods before carrying water after rainfall far upstream. These are ephemeral rivers, and that distinction matters. A river that only flows occasionally cannot support the same pattern of settlements as a reliable year-round water source. That helps explain something important about the map of this region. The coastline may look like one continuous place, but geographically it isn't. Some locations have access to water, some have ports, some have mining activity, some have towns, and between them are enormous stretches where the physical conditions remain far less suitable for dense settlement. So the mystery may not really be, why didn't people build a city along this coast? It may be a more basic question. Where would a large city get its water? And once you ask that question, the coastline starts to look very different.
But there is another part of this story that is easy to miss. An empty coastline does not necessarily mean that people never came here. For thousands of years, people adapted to different parts of this region without building the kind of permanent cities we would recognize today. The key difference was not simply whether the land was difficult. It was whether there was enough water, food, and access to support a permanent settlement. Along parts of the coast, marine resources could provide opportunities that the desert itself could not. Further inland, seasonal water and different landscapes created other possibilities. So the absence of large cities doesn't mean the coastline was completely unused. It means the relationship between people and the landscape was very different from what we see around many other African coasts. Then, European exploration changed the equation. Portuguese ships were moving down the western coast of Africa from the late 15th century as they searched for routes toward the Indian Ocean. But reaching a coastline is one thing. Building a settlement there is another. A ship can carry water. A city needs a continuous supply. And that difference would become important again and again. The major colonial settlements that developed along this broader region tended to emerge where geography offered something the desert coast often lacked: reliable water, a usable harbor, better access inland, or some combination of all three. That helps explain why the populated parts of this coastline developed as separate nodes rather than as one continuous urban corridor.
And then, centuries later, another discovery changed the value of the desert completely. The land that had seemed difficult to settle suddenly contained something people were willing to cross a desert for: diamonds. For centuries, the desert had presented a difficult equation. Very little water, very little agriculture, and very few reasons to build large permanent settlements. But diamonds changed one part of that equation. In 1908, a railway worker near Lüderitz discovered a diamond in the sand. The discovery wasn't important because one stone had been found. It was important because it suggested that the surrounding desert could contain many more. And that changed how people looked at the coastline. A landscape that had seemed economically marginal suddenly had something extremely valuable beneath and around it. The response was rapid. German authorities established tighter control over the diamond-producing areas of what was then German Southwest Africa. Large sections of the region were designated as restricted diamond areas. Access became highly controlled. Mining settlements appeared in places where permanent urban development had previously made little sense. And one of the most remarkable examples was Kolmanskop. A town was built in the middle of the desert because there was a reason to be there. For a while, the combination of mining wealth and imported supplies made the environment seem much less limiting. Water could be brought in, buildings could be constructed, infrastructure could be maintained. But there was an important difference between making a place usable for an industry and making it naturally suitable for a large population.
The diamond boom could temporarily overcome some of the desert's limitations. It could not change the climate, it could not create a permanent river, and it could not make the dunes stop moving. That distinction would become increasingly visible once the mining economy changed. Kolmanskop is perhaps the clearest example. What had once been a wealthy mining settlement eventually lost its economic purpose. People left, buildings were abandoned, and the desert gradually moved back into the town.
Today, sand occupies rooms that were once used as homes, offices, and public buildings. The image is striking, but the deeper story is more interesting. The desert didn't suddenly become impossible. The reason for maintaining a settlement there disappeared. And once that happened, the enormous effort required to keep the town functioning became much harder to justify. That pattern helps explain something important about this coastline. Human beings can build in difficult environments. The bigger question is whether there was a reason to keep paying the cost of doing it.
The colonial era eventually came to an end. But the end of colonial rule didn't automatically make this coastline easier to live on. In the north, Angola became independent from Portugal in 1975. Further south, Namibia became independent in 1990 after decades under South African administration. And by the early 1990s, the political map of the region looked very different from the one that had existed only a few decades earlier. 3 independent countries now controlled the enormous coastline between the populated areas around Luanda and Cape Town. So, at first glance, this might seem like the moment when the old restrictions would finally disappear. The colonial boundaries were gone, the old administrations were gone, and modern governments now had the ability to decide what happened along their own coastlines. Yet the coastline remained remarkably empty. That is where the story gets more interesting. Because the absence of cities here wasn't being caused by just one thing. Some areas remained restricted because of valuable resources. Some became protected natural areas. And in many other places, there simply wasn't enough water, infrastructure, or economic reason to support a large permanent population. The result was unusual. A coastline that had once been difficult to access because of colonial restrictions was now also difficult to populate for completely different reasons. And that distinction matters, because removing a political barrier doesn't necessarily remove a geographic one. You can change a border overnight. You can't change the desert quite so easily. And along this coast, the desert was still making the same demands it had made for thousands, perhaps millions of years.
But perhaps the most important part of this story is that there isn't one single reason for the emptiness. The coastline was shaped by geography long before modern borders existed. Then history added another layer. Colonial governments restricted parts of it. Mining created isolated settlements where valuable resources made the difficult environment worth dealing with. And after those periods ended, the physical geography remained. Today, large parts of the coast still combine several difficult conditions at once. Very little rainfall, limited freshwater, huge distances, difficult terrain, and relatively few places where a large settlement can develop without bringing much of its basic infrastructure with it. That doesn't mean that nobody lives here. There are towns, mining communities, coastal settlements, and people who have adapted to the environment. But they are separated by enormous stretches of land where permanent urban development is limited. And that is why the map can be misleading. From above, the Atlantic coastline looks like one continuous edge, but on the ground, it is a completely different story. A city on one part of the coast doesn't automatically connect to the next one. A road doesn't automatically make the desert easier to inhabit. And being beside the ocean doesn't automatically provide the water, land, transport, or economic activity that a large population needs. So the empty coastline between Angola and South Africa isn't really one mystery. It's several different stories overlapping in the same place. An unusual climate, a difficult desert, a complicated history, valuable resources in some areas, and enormous distances between the places where permanent settlement makes sense. Put all of those together, and the pattern becomes easier to understand. The coast isn't empty because nothing ever happened there. In many ways, the opposite is true. People came here looking for routes, resources, territory, and opportunities. They built railways, mines, and settlements. Some of those places grew quickly. Others disappeared. But through all of it, the desert remained. And today, that same combination of geography and history helps explain why one of Africa's longest Atlantic coastlines still contains such enormous stretches of almost nothing.